Greetings and welcome to the Book of Alms. I promise to discuss my thoughts on modern feminism and the fact that I strongly believe that men are actually getting a pretty bad rap based on very interesting dynamics of extremes within society. First of all, in a way, at the time, women didn't really own land or vote because they had never really thought about it. It was sort of a seed that was planted in their heads. You're oppressed, and now you need to fight for the right to vote and to own land and all of these things. What is boldly overlooked and very disconcerting to me, because if we look throughout history, dividing man and woman has been a fundamental element of enslavement. Disempowering this bond is a vital aspect to human enslavement. Because once that bond is sort of broken and that trust is broken, the men will be more docile and they will not defend, the violation of the women, etc., which history has proven. Societies where that bond between man and woman and family remain a core foundation, those societies are much stronger, they're much more united, and it's very hard to exploit or abuse them because they stand as, like a tribe. So this fundamental breakdown, now I'm not saying that men may not have been oppressive or abusive at that time, but if we look closely at what men were enduring at that time, not to make excuses for abuse or anything like that, but when I look back and I see people like Amelia Earhart and all of these really fundamental women who were doing powerful things, the world was not stopping them from achieving, So it's very interesting to me how this all transpired, especially when you look very closely at the fact that the women's movement was born at the point that children were employed. Children were being exploited. Young boys were being exploited, okay? So when we talk about this time frame and how great men had it, if you look closely at the labor movement during that time, men were rebelling. Men were being shot in factories, okay, for asking for basic fundamental rights, for fair pay, for fair working conditions, for reasonable working hours, and male children were working. So when we look back in history and claim that men had it so great, men have been enslaved continually throughout history. Men have been abused, exploited, and oppressed. Male children were, so when we think about how great they had it, 7-year-old boys and 10-year-old boys were working in factories. That's how great they had it before women came in. So they banned the child labor movement. And then they told women, oh, you're so oppressed, you should work. So immediately they have lost a huge child labor movement, which is poor children being slaved to death, many, and men rebelling and being shot in factories. And so now, to make up this difference, we're going to convince women that they need the right to work. So now they have convinced women they're oppressed, and now they're fighting actually to enter a workplace where men have already been exploited and children have already been exploited. And this was very beneficial because in that moment they doubled the workforce, which means they also doubled the taxation of the populace. So, and if anything, women entering the workforce benefited men because men actually had a heart to say women can't work in these conditions. Men can work in those conditions. Men can be shot for demanding reasonable, treatment. but men cannot work, women cannot work in those conditions. And so actually women entering the workforce actually upgraded the situation for men. It's not to say that men weren't in a higher position and that women were not paid less or whatever. There were definitely reasonable reasons to fight for equality, but the real foundation of what took place there was them, like they've done throughout history, planting a seed and getting people to actually fight for their enslavement or oppression, and in that process creating a divide between man and woman and breaking up the family, essentially, that would end up echoing through several generations. So it's very interesting to me, as I stand now, a woman who, has, been a single mother, has been a single corporate mother, who actually was never challenged when I was a full-time working corporate mother. But when I decided I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom or an artist, creative mom that actually had my children with me all the time, that is when I started to actually endure challenges in being a mother. And, because the more time I wanted to spend with my children, the more influence I wanted to have in my children's life, the more barriers I seem to encounter. So it's very interesting, especially after all of that, that, the idea of only having to be at home taking care of my family became almost like a dream. It was the standard. And we gave it up, and now we not only do all of that, but often we have to do it alone. And, I never really thought anything of it because I had grown in these societies and sort of experienced these other societies where that was the norm. But when I arrived in Israel, where these traditions were still in place and this bond was still fairly strong between man and woman, and was able to sort of contrast the dysfunctions that were born in contrast to how these basic values foster more unity and harmony within a society and a culture, I really had to start to evaluate things. I mean, I always had my kind of view of, these dynamics of feminism and how, we were sort of duped into our own enslavement, essentially, and we gave up our true natures in a lot of ways. But when I actually got to a more traditional culture where these traditional values were still strongly in place, I could actually get a really sharp contrast at the difference in happiness, the difference in harmony, the difference in compassion and, marriage and relationships and how they were valued and the harmony within them. And, it was ironic, but I feel that we've sort of come into a greater era of abuse now than ever before. And obviously, it has a lot more to do with the fact that we've rejected our natures and that we've been divided. And the hatred from these sort of propagandized seeds that have been planted in our minds, and where that's coming from, and all these unhealed wounds that people aren't really dealing with. Because as someone who has endured various of the female struggles that can result in damages that cause women to fear or dislike men, the difference for me is I was always supported, maybe from being young and always sort of being one of the guys, no matter what struggle I went through. One man may have harmed me, but I always had this group of brothers who empowered me and protected me and strengthened me. And so thanks to that, I have actually never been able to be in such a damaged state where I could not see the value and the beauty within the male species, and the need for unity, and to honor their role as, these protectors and these people who lift us up and strengthen us. And where that is lost is something that needs to really be evaluated, both largely within the women, because, it's an area of damage within the woman that needs to be healed. On the other side of that, we have these primitive natures, which is part of why these traditional societies tend to separate things, and also why these traditional societies tend to pride themselves on things like modesty, because they're really aware of these primitive natures within the species. So when we have a woman using her body as a way to gain attention or gain something from a man, and then the man also is using his ability to provide or whatever, you have two primitive aspects of the species feeding off these primitive aspects of each other, and therefore perpetuating this really primitive society, a savage society, which is what happens when these basic values are rejected and denied. I don't want to get too much into that because I actually want to do another video on modesty, because it's quite deep, as I shifted from, growing kind of confused about love and relationships in societies where everybody was divorcing, and trying to understand how do you make these things work, and trying to be hip and in and following the trends, and and not knowing why I wasn't achieving what I wanted to achieve. And a lot of that had to do with those primitive natures. So men complain about women's primitive nature, women complain about men's primitive nature, and they breed a whole dysfunction within the society without either sex really realizing that both are mutually responsible. Yet if you go and immerse yourself in a traditional culture where these basic values are in place, you're not catcalled on the street. You're not, in some cultures, they assume that I have an issue because I don't want to sleep with a stranger. These things don't happen because they are not a part of that society. They are not even considered normal. And, in a lot of ways, they're not even that attractive, which we'll get much deeper in my video about modesty. And so it's very interesting when we look at how this divide has been perpetuated and how it's bred hatred, and how there are all these damages, both within the men, because men have been used, women have been used, and so they're both angry and not actually healing the issue within themselves. That is, both of them have sort of a predatory thing going on, and they're both feeding off this predatory nature, which is part of the savage extreme of our species, which is actually our nature. This is our nature. We try to pretend that we are this way or more civilized, but without values, we are savage. If you look at any youth or generation that was raised without a proper family structure, you will see the more savage aspects emerging, because they have to seek outside themselves within the other youth. We have 2 or 3 generations where elders aren't even a thing, and it's 50 years ago, it's grandparents were a thing. They were a part of your life, and their wisdom became something, and we have generations. My entire family, I was disconnected from all of that, pretty much, because of what our society has been becoming as we lose and reject these values, which all started in this fundamental divide that actually took us away from our true natures. And in this process, we've come to a place where we are shaming men for their true natures and shaming women for being virtuous, for being modest. So it's like the positive aspects of both dynamics of the species are like being driven out, and everyone's complaining about what we've become, but yet no one will look at themselves and evaluate how they need to heal and raise their own value system, and how they value themselves and love themselves and respect their true natures, because our true natures have become something archaic or, and I mean, it's had such a profound and bitter toll on society, because when I look at a society where men still feel obligated to be in their children's lives, women still feel a necessity to be a part of the family. Childcare is not a staple. It is a way to have freedom to study or to be creative or to work on, these things. And it's ironic that we have rejected these things that were actually fundamental aspects of society, and then we are sort of bitter at the people that are able to hold on to that, because people have been convinced to sacrifice that, and then they look upon it and, almost envious, because what has caused them to reject it is because that is archaic or oppressive or whatever. It's sad to me to think, like, I actually don't feel oppressed. I feel that the way I carry myself actually tells the more primitive aspect of the species not even to waste their time. And I don't prey on that either, but at the same time, I encounter lots of people who feed off that, so it's like I almost have to isolate because people aren't relating, so it's like, people have been so programmed to buy into these aspects that aren't satisfying them. They are satisfying a very single culture, many on psychotropics or antidepressants, and many unsatisfied who spend a lot of money because they don't have family or responsibilities that cause them to be more cautious. So they spend more time out, socializing, drinking, having less fulfilling interactions, until eventually, the lack of satisfaction starts to get to them, and then, they become like one of those people that, oh, if you can't adapt, then you're broken, here's something, take it, and it'll make everything okay, but it just numbs the pain. Luckily, I've never actually had to deal with any of that, but I see the results of it all around. And so, one of the things, I'm going to get quite deep on this divide between man and woman, because we speak about the extremism in the world, we speak about the lack of love and compassion, we speak about the violence. There's so many things that actually come down to that core, and it doesn't matter if you're gay or if you're a man who wants to be a woman or whatever it is. I mean, it doesn't matter. There's still the masculine and feminine. We're not going to escape that. Even in homosexual relationships, there are still those dynamics. Even if it's two men, there's always the stronger and the more feminine, often. I think there is kind of a movement of different aspects. But this idea that we can drive out the masculine and feminine dynamics of society or reality or humanity is, also a problem. as well as thinking that we can somehow transcend duality, because duality is in every aspect of our reality, from day and night to man and woman, or masculine and feminine. I mean, duality is everything, on and off. It is everything. This paradigm is built of a dual nature so that we can learn from the contrast of our extremes. And if we really want to start balancing the world, we need to really start looking at ourselves and looking at what we can heal. And we need to empower our natures, our true natures, because the most harmonious societies, cultures, beliefs, couples, whatever you see, there is a balance there where the strengths of both are nurtured. We're not supposed to be the same. We are supposed to be different because we each have gifts that benefit the other and bring balance and harmony to the planet. So, firstly, we need to start really looking at history and looking at what men have endured and how men have fought to protect women and children throughout the ages, something that they will not be able to do when we have, emasculated them. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. And they're going to become weak as we become masculinized, and it's great. I'm a strong woman, but I'm stronger than a lot of men even sometimes. But that doesn't mean that I can't be feminine. Going into a traditional culture and being free to explore femininity really for the first time in my life, after growing in these westernized societies where, I was sort of taught to deny that. It was a very profound experience, and I have been oppressed by men, but I can't blame all men for my lack of self-worth and self-love, which caused me to allow other people to undervalue me and mistreat me. Now, in one situation, I was sort of duped and tricked. I thought it was something, and then it turned out to be an illusion. This does happen, but as long as we stay in our pain, trapped in this, bitter view that's actually being programmed into us to disempower us and divide us so that unity becomes a myth. Divide and conquer rules. You'll see it throughout everything. It comes up a lot in the things I'm discussing because I have this vision of unity and harmony, and I've been blessed to be given insight into what these fundamental divides are and the core division that we need to start with before we can repair anything else is that divide between man and woman. And it doesn't matter what your orientation is or who you like or what all of that is, we still need to learn how to respect each other. We can blame that, men rule the world, but that's not necessarily true because there were a lot of queens that ruled the world too. But again, how many men in the greater population actually rule the world? How many men are actually in, loving their work, successful? The larger portions of the population are oppressed, stifled, and even worse, abused by the one person who can nurture and heal and empower them, which is the female. That is our purpose, And it's not to say that we can't do whatever we want to do. Of course we can. And actually, many women were doing that back then. Women who didn't marry, who wrote books, and it was not as accepted as it is now. And it's absolutely great that we can vote and own land and own property, and there were things that were necessary to human evolution and to our freedom, and our ability to actually feel, dynamics like if you weren't married by this time, you were an old maid or something like that. Those are ways that women were oppressed, for sure, that needed to be dealt with. But those weren't the things that were the foundation The foundation of what drove that was child labor being banned and doubling the population that could be taxed. And we need to see that, and we need to also take a really close look at how men were treated during the labor movement before feminism. Because this projection that men are these evil things that have always had power over us is not necessarily true, because it's a lot of times in history, men have been our protectors and our defenders. And a lot of what has driven them to do that has been the love of the family and the woman. And the same goes for the women as well. So, and what I've discovered through this exploration of femininity and allowing men to be strong in their nature and then exploring my true nature, I see the strengthening between those two forces. When we're not berating them constantly, or they are not berating us. I mean, I've been in cultures where it's like, toughen up, or, you should be doing this. And it's like, it's not natural to me. That's not what I should be doing. Like, natural to me, I love to, like, bake bread and make art and heal people, And when I'm in a society that actually values that part of my nature, I thrive. And when I'm in a society that thinks something's wrong with that, or that's weak, that's when there's a problem. So the real problem is when they plant the seed that our true nature is weak and dupe us into sacrificing it, or planting the seed that the true nature, which is strong, is cruel, and therefore weaken the strength within us, male or female. We have problems. We really need to look at this. And we should not, what is most disgusting is that women are becoming abusers, and they're not even acknowledging it by the way that they treat men. And honestly, the men who've treated me unkindly were a lot less than the men who've respected me and empowered me. And so it's very interesting. And I mean, I didn't grow up in some glorious life, and I grew up with, in problematic sort of aspects, whether it was poverty or, problems within the family or whatever. I grew up in all of that, and actually many of the people who strengthened and empowered me, my brothers, also grew up in that, and we found strength within each other. And it was not about, and that's another thing. I mean, it wasn't about who was getting what from who or who was sleeping with who, because we had different values then than we see now. And that's why part of my mission very much is trying to encourage us to return to our values, to values that we're taught to reject and ridicule and attack, and really contemplate how we are responsible, whether it is for not healing the damages that are causing women to be abusive to men, or not having faith, But at the same time, those dynamics that people are bitching about, both men and women, pardon my French, are dynamics that they have bred together by making those behaviors normalized, And it's in the music, it's in the TV, it's in everything, you have to have this and you have to have that. She needs to be like, these measurements, and he needs to have this bank account, and then everybody's upset that they got used or taken advantage of. Both sides of that are, but yet look at the values that are driving them. These are not the values of love and harmony and unity. These are values of materialism and superficialness and falsity and, not really the strongest foundation when it comes to longevity, especially because those dynamics can crash and burn, especially when a society struggles or when a war comes, So It's really a profound time to return to our values, and one of the first steps to that, as you know, feminists or whatever, not to say that we don't have a need to like stand for whatever, but by attacking and oppressing and abusing the opposite sex, I can't really say that we're going to find success, because that's not a healthy modality for equality, you know. Thank you.